The rain hammered against the windows of the Bellingham Police Department with the kind of relentless fury that only November in Washington could deliver. Detective Chloe Adams pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching rivulets of water cascade down like tears she'd learned never to shed in public. 23 years on the force, and she still felt her heart race whenever Captain Morrison called her into his office after 9 p.m. Nothing good ever happened after 9 p.m. in police work. "Chloe, sit down." Morrison's voice carried that particular weight she'd heard only 3 times before in her career, each time before a case that would change everything. His silver hair caught the harsh fluorescent light as he slid a manila folder across his desk, the paper thick with the accumulated dust of forgotten promises. "I need you to look at something." She opened the folder with the careful reverence reserved for the dead. The first photograph made her stomach drop, a young woman's face frozen in black and white, eyes that would never see another sunrise. Sarah Chen, 19 years old, University of Washington student, found in Discovery Park on October 15, 2005. Chloe remembered this case like a scar that never quite healed. She'd been a junior detective then, hungry to prove herself, desperate to bring justice to a family that had traveled across an ocean to give their daughter opportunities America promised. "We got a hit on the DNA," Morrison said quietly. "After 18 years, we finally got a match." The second photograph in the folder made Chloe's world tilt on its axis. She recognized the man immediately, not from mugshots or surveillance footage, but from the countless community barbecues, school board meetings, and charity fundraisers where she'd shaken his hand and praised his civic dedication. Thomas Hartwell, 64 years old, retired high school principal, pillar of the Bellingham community. The man who'd personally written recommendation letters for hundreds of students, who'd established the Sarah Chen Memorial Scholarship that had sent 12 underprivileged kids to college. "Jesus Christ," Chloe whispered, the words escaping before her professional composure could catch them. "Tom Hartwell? Are we absolutely certain?" Morrison nodded grimly. "DNA's a 99.7% match. A sample we collected from under Sarah's fingernails finally got processed through the new database. We've been sitting on conclusive evidence for 3 months while the lab ran confirmatory tests." Chloe stared at Hartwell's photograph, the same kind smile he'd worn when she'd interviewed him as a witness 18 years ago. He'd been so helpful then, so concerned about Sarah's welfare, so heartbroken that such violence could touch their peaceful community. She remembered how he'd spoken about Sarah with genuine warmth, how he'd mentioned seeing her at the coffee shop near campus, how worried he'd been when she missed her evening shift at the campus library. "He knew her," Chloe said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "He knew her schedule, her routines. That's how he was always one step ahead of our investigation." The rain continued its assault against the windows as Morrison pulled out another folder, this one newer, filled with surveillance reports and financial records. "There's more. We've been quietly investigating for the past month. Hartwell's been making annual donations to the Sarah Chen Memorial Fund, always in cash, always exactly $5,000, always on the anniversary of her death." Chloe felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a predator's psychological patterns. The donations weren't guilt, they were trophies, a way to stay connected to her victim, to insert himself into the ongoing narrative of her death, to bask in the community's praise for honoring her memory while knowing he was the one who'd stolen her life. "We're executing the arrest warrant tomorrow morning," Morrison continued. "I want you to lead the team. You know this case better than anyone, and frankly, you're the only detective I trust to handle the media circus this is going to create." Chloe closed the folder, her mind already racing through the implications. Tom Hartwell wasn't just any community member, he was beloved. 3 generations of Bellingham students had passed through his classrooms. He'd been featured in the local newspaper just last month for his volunteer work at the food bank. His arrest would shatter the community's sense of security, would make people question every trusted authority figure in their lives. His wife, Chloe said suddenly. Margaret's been fighting cancer for 2 years. This will destroy her. The innocent always pay the price, Morrison replied, with the weary acceptance of a man who'd seen too much. But so do the guilty, eventually. That's why we do this job.
As Chloe walked back to her desk, she passed the bulletin board where Sarah Chen's photograph still hung after 18 years, part of the department's cold case gallery, a reminder of promises yet to be kept. Sarah's parents had returned to Taiwan 5 years after the murder, broken by the lack of answers, their faith in American justice shattered by the passage of time. They'd left behind only their daughter's grave in the Bellingham cemetery and a $10,000 reward that still appeared in the newspaper every October 15th. Chloe pulled out her phone and scrolled to the contact information she'd memorized, but never had reason to call with good news. David Chen, Sarah's older brother, now a professor of engineering at National Taiwan University. The 13-hour time difference meant it was already tomorrow afternoon in Taipei, but some conversations couldn't wait for convenient timing. Mr. Chen, this is Detective Adams from the Bellingham Police Department. I have news about Sarah's case. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Chloe thought the connection had failed. When David finally spoke, his voice carried 18 years of accumulated pain and hope that had been disappointed so many times it had calcified into resigned acceptance. "You found him," he said. It wasn't a question. "We found him," Chloe confirmed. "We're making the arrest tomorrow morning. I wanted you and your parents to hear it from me before it hits the news." Another long silence. Then the sound of crying, deep, guttural sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief, from a place where love and loss had been holding vigil for nearly 2 decades. "Thank you," David whispered. "Thank you for never forgetting her." After ending the call, Chloe sat alone in the empty detective bureau, surrounded by the familiar chaos of open case files, cold coffee cups, and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights. She pulled out Sarah's file, not the official one she'd just returned to Morrison's office, but her personal copy, the one she'd assembled over the years with every lead, every interview, every dead end that had haunted her dreams. The photographs told the story of a vibrant young woman whose life had been full of possibility. Sarah studying in the university library, her dark hair falling across her face as she concentrated on organic chemistry textbook. Sarah laughing with friends at a campus coffee shop, her smile lighting up the candid shot someone had taken for the student newspaper. Sarah volunteering at a local elementary school, surrounded by children who clearly adored their reading tutor. But it was the crime scene photographs that had driven Chloe's obsession with this case. Sarah hadn't died quickly or quietly. The medical examiner's report detailed a struggle that had lasted at least 20 minutes. Defensive wounds that spoke of desperate fighting. Evidence of a young woman who'd fought for her life with the fierce determination of someone who had too much to live for to surrender easily. Chloe had interviewed Tom Hartwell 3 times during the original investigation. He'd been one of dozens of community members who'd come forward with information, most of it useless, but all of it offered with apparent sincerity. Hartwell had mentioned seeing Sarah at various locations around town, had expressed concern about her walking alone at night, and had even suggested that the police increase patrols near the university. At the time, his involvement had seemed like that of a concerned educator who'd felt protective of all young people in the community. Now, reviewing her notes with the clarity that comes from knowing the truth, Chloe could see the patterns she'd missed. Hartwell's information had always been just slightly too detailed, his concern just slightly too intimate. He'd known Sarah's schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. He'd positioned himself as a helpful witness while using the investigation to track the progress of the case, to ensure he stayed ahead of any leads that might point in his direction. The most chilling detail was one Chloe had noted but never fully processed. Hartwell had been the one to suggest that Sarah's murder might be connected to her status as an international student, had theorized that perhaps she'd been targeted because of anti-Asian sentiment in the community. It was a cruel manipulation that had sent the investigation down numerous false paths, while painting him as a progressive educator concerned about hate crimes.
Chloe's phone buzzed with a text message from her partner, Detective Ray Kowalski. Saw the late meeting light. Everything okay? Need backup? She smiled, despite the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Ray had been her partner for 7 years, had seen her through 2 divorces, her father's death, and countless 3 a.m. crime scenes that still visited her dreams. He'd also been there for every October 15th when she'd stood at Sarah Chen's grave and made the same promise she'd made every year, that she wouldn't stop looking, wouldn't stop caring, wouldn't let the case disappear into the bureaucratic void where so many cold cases went to die. Big break on the Chen case, she texted back. Arrest warrant tomorrow. Call you at 6 a.m. Holy shit. For real this time? For real this time. Chloe gathered the photographs and returned them to the file, but she kept one, a candid shot of Sarah laughing with friends outside the Student Union building. In the background of the photo, barely visible but unmistakably present, stood Tom Hartwell. He was watching Sarah with an expression that, 18 years later, Chloe could finally recognize as predatory obsession disguised as benevolent concern. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows as Chloe prepared to leave the office. Tomorrow would bring media attention, community outrage, and the complex process of dismantling the reputation of a man who'd spent decades building trust specifically to betray it. There would be questions about how he'd evaded detection for so long, criticism of the original investigation, demands for accountability that would ripple through every level of local government. But tonight, for the first time in 18 years, Sarah Chen's case file would rest easy. The hunt was over. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally within reach. As Chloe walked to her car through the November rain, she thought about the phone calls she'd make in the morning to the Bellingham cemetery. Tomorrow, someone would place fresh flowers on Sarah's grave, not the anonymous bouquet that appeared every October 15th, which Chloe now realized had been another of Tom Hartwell's psychological trophies, but flowers from a community that could finally grieve properly, knowing the truth. The parking lot was empty except for her 15-year-old Honda Civic and Morrison's pickup truck. As she unlocked her car, Chloe wondered how many other cold cases might find new life because of advances in DNA technology, how many other families might finally get the answers they deserved. But mostly, she thought about Sarah Chen, 19 years old forever, her potential unrealized, but her memory finally vindicated. The drive home through Bellingham's quiet streets felt different than usual. Past the high school where Tom Hartwell had shaped 3 generations of students, past the coffee shop where he'd first spotted Sarah, past the entrance to Discovery Park where a young woman's life had ended and a killer's double life had begun. Tomorrow, all of these familiar places would carry new weight, new meaning, new questions about how evil could hide behind a facade of respectability for 18 years. Chloe Adams had learned to live with ghosts long before she became a detective. Her apartment, a converted loft above Bellingham's old maritime museum, was filled with the accumulated evidence of 2 decades spent pursuing justice for people she'd never met in life but knew intimately in death.
The walls were lined with bookshelves containing not novels or poetry, but forensic science journals, criminal psychology textbooks, and three-ring binders labeled with case numbers that had become as familiar to her as family names. The Sarah Chen file occupied the top shelf of the bookcase closest to her kitchen table, positioned so she could see it while drinking her morning coffee and eating the same breakfast she had consumed every day for 7 years: steel-cut oats with blueberries, black coffee, and whatever fruit was in season at the farmer's market. Routine was armor against chaos, and Chloe's life had been shaped by the understanding that chaos was always waiting just beyond the edge of controlled order. She woke at 4:47 a.m. on November 12th, 3 minutes before her alarm, as she had every morning since her divorce from Marcus became final. The apartment was cold. She kept her thermostat at 62 degrees, partly for the utility savings, but mostly because the discomfort helped her stay alert, kept her edges sharp. She made her coffee in the same blue ceramic mug her father had given her when she graduated from the police academy, a mug that had witnessed every breakthrough and every disappointment of her career. The morning ritual included checking the overnight reports from dispatch, scanning the Seattle Times for any developments in regional cases, and reviewing her active files before most of the city was awake. But today, she found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering how she'd explain to a community that the man they trusted with their children's education had been capable of such calculated evil. Chloe had joined the Bellingham Police Department in 2001, fresh from her criminal justice degree at Western Washington University, driven by the kind of idealism that experience hadn't yet tempered with cynicism. Her father, Lieutenant Colonel James Adams, had spent 30 years in the Army Military Police, and dinner table conversations throughout her childhood had revolved around concepts of duty, justice, and the thin line that separated order from chaos. When she'd announced her intention to become a police detective, he'd smiled with the kind of pride that made all the late-night studying worth it. "The job will ask everything of you," he'd warned her during their last conversation before cancer took him in 2018. "The question is whether you can give everything to the job without losing yourself in the process." It was a question she'd been grappling with for 23 years, especially during the long stretches when cases went cold and families stopped calling for updates. The Sarah Chen case had been her first major investigation as lead detective, assigned to her in 2007 when the original detective retired and Captain Morrison decided she'd earned the opportunity to prove herself on something significant. She'd thrown herself into the case with the kind of obsessive dedication that had cost her 2 marriages and most of her friendships outside the department. While other detectives went home to dinner with their families, Chloe spent evenings at the university library trying to understand Sarah's academic routine. She'd interviewed every professor, every classmate, every employee at every business Sarah had frequented. She'd walked Sarah's daily route from her apartment to campus so many times that she could navigate it blindfolded, had memorized every shortcut, every well-lit area, every potential danger zone. The investigation had consumed her personal life in ways that were simultaneously necessary and destructive. She learned to speak basic Mandarin so she could communicate more effectively with Sarah's parents during their visits to Bellingham. She'd studied Asian cultural dynamics, immigration patterns, and the specific challenges faced by international students. She'd become an expert on Sarah Chen's life, while her own life gradually narrowed to the confines of professional obsession. Her first marriage to David, a software engineer she'd met at Western, ended in 2009 when he'd grown tired of competing for attention with dead people. "You care more about Sarah Chen than you care about me," he'd said during their final argument, and Chloe hadn't been able to deny it because it was true. Her second marriage to Marcus, a firefighter who'd understood the demands of public service, had lasted longer, but ended for similar reasons in 2019. Marcus had been more patient, more supportive, but even he'd eventually realized that Chloe's relationship with her cold cases was more intimate than her relationship with living people. "You don't solve cases," Marcus had told her the night he'd moved out. "You carry them. There's a difference, and it's killing you." The truth was that Chloe carried all of them: Sarah Chen, Angela Morrison, no relation to the captain, Kevin Walsh, and Maria Santos, and a dozen others whose files lined her shelves like memorial candles for the unavenged dead. Each case had taught her something about human nature, about the thin veneer of civilization that could be stripped away by greed, passion, desperation, or a simple cruelty. But Sarah's case had been different from the beginning, had lodged itself in her consciousness like a splinter that couldn't be removed without causing more damage. Part of it was the timing. Sarah had been killed during Chloe's first year as a lead detective, when she still believed that dedication and intelligence were sufficient to solve any crime. Part of it was the victim herself, a young woman whose life had been full of promise, whose dreams had extended beyond herself to include the family she'd hoped to help financially and the medical research she'd planned to pursue. But mostly it was the injustice of watching a case grow cold despite having physical evidence, witnesses, and a clear timeline of Sarah's final days. Chloe had developed a routine of visiting Sarah's grave every October 15th, the anniversary of her death. She'd bring fresh flowers, always daisies, which had been Sarah's favorite according to her roommate, and spend an hour talking to the headstone as if Sarah could hear her progress reports. She'd update her on new leads, new technologies, new hopes for resolution. She'd apologize for the delays, for the bureaucratic obstacles, for the way the case had been shuffled from active to cold when the initial leads had dried up.
The visits had become a form of meditation, a way to reconnect with the human element that sometimes got lost in the technical aspects of investigation. Sarah's headstone bore both English and Chinese inscriptions, along with a photograph that showed her laughing with friends at a campus picnic. Looking at that photograph, Chloe always felt the weight of unfulfilled responsibility, not just to solve the case, but to ensure that Sarah's life was remembered for more than just the violence that had ended it. The breakthrough in DNA technology that had finally identified Tom Hartwell felt like vindication, but it also felt like reproach. Why had it taken 18 years? What other evidence had been overlooked? How many other opportunities for justice had been missed because of limited resources, outdated technology, or simple human error? Chloe's kitchen table was covered with materials related to the Hartwell arrest: warrant paperwork, tactical planning documents, media strategy notes, and a thick folder containing everything they'd learned about the suspect during the past month of quiet investigation. Tom Hartwell's life on paper looked like a Norman Rockwell painting: stable marriage, successful career, active in community organizations, respected by colleagues and students alike. But Chloe had learned to look beyond surfaces, to recognize the patterns that predators used to camouflage their true nature. The most disturbing aspect of Hartwell's profile was his systematic involvement in Sarah's memorial activities. Not only had he made annual donations to the scholarship fund, but he'd also attended every memorial service, served on the committee that had established the campus safety improvements made in Sarah's name, and had been instrumental in creating the International Student Support Program that had been one of Sarah's final projects before her death. It was a level of psychological manipulation that suggested long-term planning and a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit community grief for personal satisfaction. Hartwell hadn't just killed Sarah and disappeared. He'd inserted himself into the ongoing narrative of her memory, had positioned himself as someone who cared about preventing similar tragedies while knowing he was the one responsible for the original tragedy. Chloe's phone rang at 5:30 a.m. Ray Kowalski, calling as promised. "Tell me this isn't another dead end," Ray said without preamble. "Tell me we're finally going to get this bastard." "DNA match is solid. 99.7% probability. We've got him, Ray." Jesus. Tom Hartwell? I coached Little League with this guy 5 years ago. My kid had him for AP History. How the hell did we miss this for 18 years? It was a question that would haunt the investigation's aftermath, but Chloe had already spent sleepless nights examining their original work.
The truth was that they hadn't missed anything obvious. Hartwell had been interviewed as a witness, not a suspect, and his information had been helpful enough that he'd never triggered the kind of scrutiny reserved for potential perpetrators. He'd been hiding in plain sight, protected by his reputation and his apparent willingness to cooperate with the investigation. He was good at it, better than we were prepared for at the time. But we've got him now, and that's what matters. The arrest team assembled at 6:30 a.m. in the police department's briefing room. Along with Chloe and Ray, the team included 4 patrol officers, a SWAT specialist for tactical support, and District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who would handle the initial charging documents. The mood was tense, but focused. Everyone understood the significance of arresting a beloved community figure, and everyone knew that the execution would need to be flawless to withstand the scrutiny that would follow. Hartwell's routine is predictable, Chloe explained, pointing to surveillance photos on the briefing room's whiteboard. He walks his dog every morning at 7:15. Same route through Fairhaven Park. He stops at the coffee shop on Harris Street, buys a large black coffee and a blueberry muffin, sits at the same table by the window for 20 minutes while he reads the newspaper. We'll take him there. Public location, witnesses, minimal chance for resistance. Captain Morrison entered the briefing room carrying a second folder, this one marked with the red stripe that indicated active media monitoring. Channel 4 is already sniffing around. Someone leaked that we're making a major arrest today. We need to move fast and clean, people. By noon, this is going to be the biggest story in the Northwest. The arrest of Tom Hartwell unfolded with the kind of surreal precision that would be replayed on news broadcasts for months to come. At exactly 7:23 a.m. on November 12, 2024, as Hartwell sat at his usual table in the Morning Glory coffee shop, reading an article about the city council's budget deliberations, Detective Chloe Adams approached his table with the careful composure of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind for 18 years.
Tom Hartwell? She displayed her badge, though he'd known her by sight for nearly 2 decades. I'm Detective Adams with the Bellingham Police Department. I need you to come with me. The coffee shop fell silent as conversation stopped mid-sentence, and 23 customers turned to watch a scene that would shatter their understanding of their community's safety. Hartwell's face went through a sequence of expressions that Chloe had witnessed countless times during her career. Confusion, recognition, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he'd been expecting this moment for longer than anyone might have imagined. "Is this about Sarah Chen?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough surprise to maintain the pretense of innocence while acknowledging what they both knew to be true. "Stand up slowly and place your hands behind your back," Chloe instructed, producing handcuffs that felt heavier than usual. "Thomas Hartwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Chen. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning echoed through the coffee shop like a funeral dirge for the community's innocence. Behind the counter, Margaret Thompson, who'd served Hartwell his morning coffee for 12 years, dropped a ceramic mug that shattered against the floor with a sound that seemed to punctuate the end of an era. In the corner booth, retired teacher Helen Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, began crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched a colleague and friend being led away in handcuffs. The scene outside the coffee shop resembled something from a disaster movie. Word had spread through the community's informal networks with a speed that only genuine shock could generate. Parents who'd trusted their children to Hartwell's classroom stood on the sidewalk in clusters, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, anger, and the kind of profound betrayal that comes from discovering that evil had been hiding behind a smile they'd seen at school board meetings and community fundraisers. Channel 4's news van arrived as Hartwell was being placed in the police cruiser, followed immediately by reporters from the Seattle Times, the Bellingham Herald, and 3 additional television stations that had monitored police scanners and recognized the significance of a murder arrest in a community where violent crime was rare enough to make headlines. The media presence transformed Hare Street into a circus of satellite trucks, camera crews, and reporters shouting questions that no one was prepared to answer. Detective Adams, can you confirm this arrest is related to the 2005 murder of Sarah Chen? Was Tom Hartwell a suspect during the original investigation? How do you respond to community members who say this arrest is impossible? Chloe ignored the questions and focused on the procedure that would ensure Hartwell's rights were protected and the case remained solid despite the media scrutiny. But as she watched the man she'd been hunting for 18 years disappear into the back of Ray's police cruiser, she felt an unexpected absence of satisfaction. This wasn't the triumphant conclusion she'd imagined during countless sleepless nights. It was the beginning of a much more complicated process of community healing and institutional accountability. The first phone call came at 8:47 a.m. as Chloe was booking Hartwell into the county jail. Margaret Hartwell, Tom's wife of 39 years, called the police department's main number and was transferred to Chloe's desk. Her voice was barely audible above the sound of her own sobbing, each word separated by gasps that suggested she was struggling to breathe. "Detective Adams, this is Margaret Hartwell. Please tell me this is a mistake. Please tell me you've arrested the wrong person." Chloe had prepared for this conversation, had even practiced responses that would be both truthful and compassionate. But hearing the genuine anguish in Margaret's voice made every rehearsed phrase feel inadequate. This was a woman who'd been married to a killer for 39 years without knowing it, who'd shared a bed with someone capable of calculated violence, who'd praised her husband's community service while unknowing that his volunteer work had been part of an elaborate psychological camouflage.
"Mrs. Hartwell, I can't discuss the details of the case with you," Chloe replied gently, "but I can tell you that your husband has been provided with legal representation and that he's being treated according to all appropriate protocols." "He coached Little League for 15 years, Margaret continued, her voice rising with desperation. "He helped hundreds of students get into college. He volunteers at the food bank every Thursday. He cried when we watched the news about Sarah Chen's murder. He cried, Detective Adams. How could someone who cried for a victim be the person who killed her?" The question contained layers of psychological complexity that would require months of expert testimony to fully address. Chloe had investigated enough cases involving respected community members to understand that the capacity for compartmentalization among certain criminals was almost superhuman. They could genuinely grieve for their victims while simultaneously taking pride in having committed the perfect crime. They could establish memorial funds and attend vigils while secretly relishing their ability to manipulate community emotions. "Mrs. Hartwell, I recommend that you contact a lawyer and that you take care of yourself during this difficult time. There are victim services available through the county that can help you navigate what's going to be a very challenging period." After hanging up, Chloe sat in her car in the police department parking lot and allowed herself the first moment of emotional processing she'd had since opening Tom Hartwell's file the previous evening. The rain had returned with Pacific Northwest persistence, drumming against her windshield in rhythms that seemed to match the complexity of her feelings. Relief that Sarah's killer had finally been identified, anger that it had taken 18 years and advances in DNA technology to achieve justice that should have been swift and certain, sadness for Margaret Hartwell and the dozens of other innocent people whose lives would be forever changed by the revelation of Tom's true nature. But mostly, she felt the weight of questions that would define the next phase of her career. How had Tom Hartwell evaded detection for so long? What other crimes might he have committed during the 18 years between Sarah's murder and his arrest? How many other cold cases might find new life if investigators re-examined evidence with fresh understanding of how predators could hide within positions of community trust? The second wave of phone calls began at 10:15 a.m. Parents whose children had been in Hartwell's classes, community members who'd worked with him on various committees, and dozens of former students who were struggling to reconcile their memories of an inspirational teacher with the reality of his arrest for murder. Each call added another layer of complexity to what was already shaping up to be one of the most psychologically challenging cases of Chloe's career. Jennifer Walsh, the district attorney, arrived at the police department at 11:30 a.m. with a legal team that included 2 assistant prosecutors and a victims' rights advocate who would coordinate with Sarah Chen's family in Taiwan. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m., which gave them less than 3 hours to prepare a statement that would satisfy public curiosity without compromising the prosecution. "The media's calling this the biggest criminal case in Bellingham's history," Walsh announced as she spread legal documents across the conference room table. "We need to be perfect from the beginning, because Tom Hartwell's defense team is going to challenge everything: the original investigation, the DNA evidence, the 18-year delay in bringing charges, everything." Chloe reviewed the charging documents while Walsh outlined the prosecution's strategy. Murder in the first degree, based on evidence of premeditation and the calculated nature of the crime. The DNA evidence was solid, but building a complete case would require reconstructing events from 18 years ago, using witnesses whose memories had faded and physical evidence that had been stored under varying conditions over nearly 2 decades. "What about other potential victims?" asked Assistant DA Michael Rodriguez. "If Hartwell was capable of killing Sarah Chen and evading detection for 18 years, what are the odds he stopped at one murder?" It was a question that had been haunting Chloe since the DNA match had been confirmed. Serial killers rarely committed isolated crimes, especially when their first murder had been successful in evading detection. She'd already begun the process of cross-referencing Hartwell's employment history with unsolved cases in Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California, looking for patterns that might suggest additional victims.
"We're reviewing cold cases going back to 1985, when Hartwell started teaching," Chloe replied. "So far, we've identified 6 potential cases that share similar characteristics: young women, isolated locations, evidence of struggle, no clear suspects. It's going to take months to work through all the possibilities." The press conference was held in the police department's main briefing room, which had been hastily converted to accommodate 17 news organizations and 43 reporters who traveled from as far south as San Francisco to cover the story. Captain Morrison delivered the primary statement, his words carefully crafted to provide necessary information without jeopardizing the prosecution. At approximately 7:30 a.m. this morning, the Bellingham Police Department arrested Thomas Hartwell, age 64, in connection with the October 15, 2005 murder of Sarah Chen. Mr. Hartwell has been charged with murder in the first degree and is currently being held in the Whatcom County Jail without bond. This arrest is the result of new DNA evidence processed through advanced forensic technology that was not available during the original investigation. The questions that followed revealed the complexity of community reaction to the arrest. Reporters had already interviewed dozens of Bellingham residents, and the responses ranged from absolute disbelief to anger that a killer had been allowed to remain free for 18 years. Several parents had organized an emergency school board meeting to demand investigations into whether Hartwell had committed crimes against his students. 3 former students had already contacted attorneys to explore potential civil lawsuits related to emotional trauma from learning they'd been taught by an accused killer. Detective Adams asked Jennifer Hayes from Channel 4, "You've been working on the Sarah Chen case for 17 years. How does it feel to finally have a suspect in custody?" Chloe had anticipated this question but found herself searching for words that could adequately express the complexity of her emotions. Sarah Chen was 19 years old when she was murdered. She had dreams of becoming a doctor, plans to help her family financially, and a future full of possibilities that were stolen from her. Today's arrest doesn't bring Sarah back, but it represents our commitment to ensuring that those who commit violent crimes will eventually be held accountable. "Is Tom Hartwell suspected in any other cases?" pressed David Kim from the Seattle Times. "We are reviewing other unsolved cases to determine if there are any connections," Captain Morrison answered carefully. "That review is ongoing and will take considerable time to complete thoroughly." After the press conference, Chloe returned to her desk to find 17 phone messages from reporters, 12 from community members, and 1 from David Chen in Taiwan. She returned David's call first, knowing that Sarah's family deserved updates before anyone else. Detective Adams. David's voice was clearer today, strengthened by the news that his sister's killer had finally been identified. My parents want to know, will they need to come to America for the trial? Probably not for several months. The legal process will take time, and we'll keep you informed of all major developments. But David, there's something else. We think Tom Hartwell might have killed other people. If that's true, your sister's case might help us solve other families' tragedies. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute before David responded. Sarah would have liked that, he said quietly. She always wanted to help people. If her case can help other families find justice, that would give her death some meaning. The rest of the afternoon brought a parade of visitors to the police department, each representing a different aspect of the community's struggle to process the revelation of Tom Hartwell's double life. Helen Morrison, the retired teacher who'd worked with Hartwell for 23 years, arrived at 3:30 p.m. carrying a box of materials she'd gathered from her home office. I've been thinking about this all day, she told Chloe, setting the box on the detective's desk with trembling hands. Tom and I collaborated on curriculum development for 15 years. We shared an office for 3 of those years. I keep trying to remember if there were signs, if there were things I should have noticed.
The box contained lesson plans, committee meeting notes, and photographs from various school events spanning 2 decades of Tom Hartwell's teaching career. Helen had highlighted passages in the documents where Hartwell had expressed particular interest in student safety, campus security, and the vulnerability of young women attending college. What had seemed like appropriate professional concern at the time now carried more sinister implications. "Look at this," Helen said, pulling out a memo Hartwell had written to the school administration in 2003, 2 years before Sarah's murder. He's recommending changes to the evening class schedule because he's concerned about female students walking to their cars alone after dark. He even volunteers to escort students to the parking lot. Chloe read the memo with growing unease. It was dated September 15, 2003, and contained detailed observations about security vulnerabilities around the high school campus. Hartwell had mapped out areas with poor lighting, identified times when security patrols were minimal, and provided specific recommendations for improving student safety. The level of detail suggested extensive observation and planning. "Mrs. Morrison, did Tom ever volunteer for evening escort duty?" "Oh yes, for about 2 years. He was very dedicated to it. Sometimes he'd stay late even when there weren't any evening classes. Said he wanted to make sure the building was secure." Helen paused, her face growing pale as the implications became clear. "Detective Adams, do you think he was using those patrols to study potential victims?" The question hung in the air like an accusation against their collective blindness. Chloe was beginning to understand that Tom Hartwell hadn't simply evaded detection through luck or incompetence on the part of investigators. He'd systematically positioned himself within the community's safety infrastructure, had volunteered for roles that gave him access to information about vulnerable individuals, while simultaneously building his reputation as someone who cared about protecting those same people. At 4:15 p.m., Chloe received a call from Dr. Amanda Richardson, a forensic psychologist from the University of Washington who'd been following the case through media reports. Dr. Richardson had studied cases involving what she termed pillar-of-the-community killers, individuals who used respected social positions to mask predatory behavior. "Dr. Adams, I've been reviewing the public information about Tom Hartwell, and I think you're dealing with something more sophisticated than a typical murder case," Dr. Richardson explained. "The memorial donations, the scholarship involvement, the security volunteerism, these aren't signs of guilt or remorse. They're indicators of someone who derives psychological satisfaction from manipulating community emotions and inserting himself into the ongoing narrative of his victim's memory." "What does that mean for the investigation?" "It means he's probably not a one-time killer. This level of psychological manipulation requires practice, refinement, and escalation. He's likely been testing boundaries and refining his methods for years, possibly decades. You should be looking at missing persons cases, unsolved deaths, and instances of young women who disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances anywhere Hartwell has lived or worked." The call ended with Dr. Richardson offering to assist with the psychological profile that would be crucial for both prosecution and investigation into potential additional crimes. but her assessment confirmed Chloe's growing suspicion that Sarah Chen's case was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex investigation. By 5 p.m., the police department's phone system was overwhelmed by calls from community members, reporters, and law enforcement agencies from across the Pacific Northwest. 3 other police departments had called to report unsolved cases that might be connected to Hartwell. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had contacted Captain Morrison to offer assistance with what was clearly evolving into a multi-jurisdictional investigation. The most disturbing call came from Detective Lisa Park with the Seattle Police Department. She'd been reviewing cold cases from the 1990s and identified 2 murders that shared characteristics with Sarah Chen's case: Rebecca Martinez, 22, killed in 1997, and Jennifer Thompson, 20, killed in 1999. Both had been University of Washington students, both had been found in isolated areas of city parks, and both cases had gone cold despite extensive investigations. The interesting thing, Detective Park explained, is that we interviewed a high school teacher from Bellingham as part of our investigation into Rebecca Martinez. He'd attended an education conference at UW the week she was killed, had mentioned seeing her in the library. He was very helpful, very concerned about campus safety, gave us detailed information about security vulnerabilities around the university. Tom Hartwell, Chloe asked, though she already knew the answer. Tom Hartwell. Same helpful witness routine, same detailed knowledge of the victim's routines, same concern about safety that seemed professional and appropriate at the time.
The connection between cases opened up terrifying possibilities. If Hartwell had been killing young women across Washington state for decades, the total number of victims could be substantially higher than anyone had imagined. Each potential case would require extensive investigation. Each family would need to be contacted. Each jurisdiction would need to coordinate evidence and witness testimony. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 6:30 p.m., as darkness fell over Bellingham and the media trucks continued their vigil outside the police department, Chloe found herself alone in the detective bureau with a growing stack of case files that might be connected to Tom Hartwell. The Sarah Chen file, which had consumed her professional life for 17 years, was now just one folder among dozens that would define the next phase of her career. She called Ray Kowalski, who'd been coordinating with the FBI team assigned to review potential connected cases. "How many are we looking at?" she asked. "Potentially 15 to 20 cases across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California dating back to 1987. All young women, all isolated locations, all unsolved. The FBI is running Hartwell's employment history, conference attendance, and travel records against the dates and locations of unsolved homicides." Jesus, 15 to 20 victims? Maybe more. The guy's been teaching for 37 years, Chloe. If he started killing in the late 80s and got away with it, there's no reason to think he stopped with Sarah Chen. After hanging up, Chloe walked to the bulletin board where Sarah Chen's photograph still occupied the center position among the department's cold cases. But now, Sarah's image was surrounded by photographs of other young women: Rebecca Martinez, Jennifer Thompson, Lisa Walsh, Maria Santos, Amanda Chen, no relation, and a dozen others whose cases might finally find resolution after years of frustrated investigation. The media attention intensified throughout the evening as national news organizations picked up the story of a beloved teacher's arrest for a murder that had haunted a community for 18 years. CNN sent a correspondent to Bellingham, followed by reporters from ABC, NBC, and CBS. The story had all the elements that attracted national attention: a respected authority figure's fall of grace, a cold case solved through DNA technology, and the psychological complexity of a killer who'd hidden in plain sight while receiving praise for his contributions to the community. Margaret Hartwell's house became the focus of intense media scrutiny, as reporters and camera crews gathered on her front lawn hoping to capture an interview with the accused killer's wife. She'd drawn all the curtains and disconnected her phone, but the siege continued throughout the evening as neighbors gathered in small groups to discuss the impossibility of what they'd learned about someone they'd known and trusted for decades. The Bellingham High School, where Hartwell had taught for 31 years, announced that it would be closed the following day, while administrators, counselors, and law enforcement officials developed a plan for helping students and staff process the traumatic revelation about their former colleague. The school board called an emergency meeting for Thursday evening to address community concerns and begin the process of reviewing Hartwell's personnel file for any missed warning signs. 3 former students contacted the police department to report that Hartwell had made them uncomfortable during their time in his classes, though none described behavior that would have warranted investigation at the time. The reports were consistent with patterns that forensic psychologists had identified in other cases involving authority figures who abused their positions: boundary testing, inappropriate personal questions, offers of special help or attention that seemed caring but created opportunities for private interaction. At 8:45 p.m., as Chloe prepared to leave the office after 14 hours of non-stop work, her phone rang with a call from David Chen in Taiwan. It was already late morning there, and he'd been following American news coverage of his sister's case throughout the night. "Detective Adams, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about other families who might find justice through Sarah's case. My parents want to establish a fund to help with the investigation costs. They understand that solving other cases might take resources the police department doesn't have."
Chloe felt a tightness in her throat that made speaking difficult. After 18 years of disappointment and false leads, Sarah's family was offering to fund the investigation that might bring justice to other families facing the same uncertainty they'd endured for so long. "That's incredibly generous, David. But you should know that the investigation is likely to take years. There might be dozens of cases to review, hundreds of witnesses to re-interview. It's going to be a long, difficult process." "Sarah was going to be a doctor," David replied. "She wanted to heal people, to prevent suffering. If her case can help prevent other families from going through what we've gone through, that's the closest thing to healing we're likely to find." The conversation ended with David promising to coordinate with victim services regarding the fund establishment and the family's potential travel to America for Hartwell's trial. But as Chloe drove home through Bellingham's quiet streets, she found herself thinking about the psychological toll that would be extracted from everyone involved in the expanded investigation. Each potential case represented not just evidence to be analyzed and witnesses to be interviewed, but families who'd spent years wondering what had happened to their daughters, sisters, friends. Each family would face the same emotional complexity that the Chen family had navigated: relief at finally having answers, mixed with renewed grief for losses that had never fully healed. The drive home took her past Tom Hartwell's house, a modest 2-story colonial in a neighborhood of similar homes occupied by teachers, nurses, city employees, and retirees. The house was dark except for a single light in what appeared to be the kitchen, where Margaret Hartwell was presumably struggling to understand how 39 years of marriage could have been built on such fundamental deception. Wondered what Margaret was thinking as she sat alone in a house that must now feel contaminated by the presence of evil she'd never suspected. Was she reviewing 39 years of memories, looking for signs she'd missed? Was she questioning every conversation, every explanation for late evenings and weekend absences, every expression of concern for community safety that had seemed admirable but might have been camouflage for predatory behavior? The complexity of Margaret's situation represented just one aspect of the community trauma that would unfold over the coming months. Tom Hartwell hadn't just killed Sarah Chen and possibly dozens of other young women. He'd betrayed the trust of an entire community, had used their respect and affection as cover for activities that violated every moral and legal standard they held dear.
The interrogation of Tom Hartwell began at 9 a.m. on November 13, 2024, in Interview Room 3 of the Bellingham Police Department. The room had been equipped with new recording equipment specifically for this case, knowing that every word, every gesture, every micro-expression would be scrutinized by prosecutors, defense attorneys, forensic psychologists, and eventually a jury that would decide whether a man who'd spent 37 years shaping young minds was guilty of destroying them. Chloe entered the room carrying 3 folders: Sarah Chen's complete case file, the DNA evidence documentation, and a preliminary file on potential connected cases. She'd slept 4 hours the previous night, fueled by coffee and the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing she was about to confront the person who'd been the focus of her professional obsession for 17 years. Tom Hartwell sat at the metal table wearing an orange jail jumpsuit that seemed to diminish his physical presence. Without his usual cardigan sweater, wire-rimmed glasses, and comfortable classroom demeanor, he looked older, smaller, more ordinary. His hands were folded on the table, his posture straight but not defiant. When Chloe entered, he looked up with an expression that seemed almost relieved. "Good morning, Detective Adams. I suppose you have questions for me." His attorney, Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah Chen, a criminal defense lawyer from Seattle who'd driven north immediately after hearing about the arrest, sat beside his client with the alert tension of someone who knew this case would define the next several years of his career. He'd already filed motions challenging the DNA evidence and requesting a change of venue, arguing that his client couldn't receive a fair trial in a community where he'd been a public figure for 3 decades.
Mr. Hartwell, Chloe began, activating the recording equipment, "You've been advised of your rights, and you've chosen to speak with me in the presence of your attorney. I want to talk to you about the morning of October 15th, 2005, and the murder of Sarah Chen." Hartwell's hands remained folded, but Chloe noticed a slight tremor in his fingers. Not fear, she realized, but something closer to anticipation. He'd been carrying this secret for 18 years, and part of him seemed ready to finally share the burden. "I remember Sarah," Hartwell said after a long pause. "She was a lovely young woman, very dedicated to her studies, very kind to the younger students she tutored. Her death was a tragedy that affected our entire community." The response was perfectly crafted, acknowledging familiarity with the victim while expressing appropriate concern and sorrow. But Chloe had conducted hundreds of interviews with suspects who'd learned to weaponize sincerity, who'd practiced responses that would seem cooperative while revealing nothing incriminating. "How well did you know Sarah?" "Not well, personally. I'd see her around town, at the coffee shop, sometimes at the library when I was there for school research. We'd spoken a few times about her studies, about her plans for medical school. She was very ambitious, very focused on helping others." Chloe opened the DNA evidence folder and placed the laboratory report on the table between them. "Mr. Hartwell, your DNA was found under Sarah Chen's fingernails. The lab analysis shows a 99.7% probability that the genetic material came from you. Can you explain how your DNA came to be on Sarah's body?" The question hung in the air for nearly 2 minutes while Hartwell stared at the laboratory report. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Hartwell shook his head slightly. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed subtly, not to one of guilt or fear, but to something that resembled the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "I suppose there's no point in denying it anymore," he said quietly. "Yes, I killed Sarah Chen." The confession hit the room like a physical force. Robert Chen immediately interrupted. "My client wishes to invoke his right to remain silent." But Hartwell raised his hand. "No, Bob. I'm tired of carrying this alone. Detective Adams has been very patient, very thorough. She deserves to hear the truth."
Chloe fought to maintain her professional composure while feeling 18 years of investigation and frustration crystallize into this moment. She'd imagined this confession countless times, had prepared for various scenarios, but the reality felt both more and less dramatic than she had expected. "Tell me what happened on October 15th, 2005. Hartwell leaned back in his chair and began speaking with the kind of careful precision that suggested he'd rehearsed this story many times in private. "I'd been watching Sarah for several weeks, not stalking exactly, but observing her routines, her habits. She had a pattern of jogging through Discovery Park on Sunday mornings, always the same route, always around the same time. Why Sarah? What made you choose her?" "She reminded me of someone, a student I'd taught years earlier who'd rejected my attention. Sarah had that same confidence, that same assumption that she was safe in the world because she was young and bright and had people who cared about her. And she agreed. She trusted me. I was a teacher, a community member she recognized from around town. Of course she trusted me." The statement carried a note of bitter satisfaction, as if Sarah's trust had been both the thing he'd wanted to betray and the thing that had made betraying it so satisfying. Chloe opened Sarah's case file and removed photographs from the crime scene. "Sarah fought you. The medical examiner found extensive defensive wounds. She didn't die easily." Hartwell's composure flickered for the first time, and Chloe caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine emotion, not remorse, but frustration, as if Sarah's resistance had been a personal affront to his planning and preparation. "She was stronger than I'd expected, more determined. I thought she'd be frightened, compliant. Instead, she fought like someone who believed she could win." "What did you do after you killed her?" "I went home, showered, changed clothes, burned the clothes I'd been wearing in my backyard fire pit. Then I went to the hardware store to buy fertilizer for my garden, made sure to chat with the clerks so they'd remember seeing me that morning." The methodical nature of his post-crime behavior revealed the level of premeditation and planning that had gone into Sarah's murder. This hadn't been a crime of passion followed by panic, but a calculated act followed by equally calculated cover-up activities designed to establish an alibi and eliminate physical evidence. Over the next few days, I made sure to express appropriate concern about Sarah's disappearance. I attended the community meetings, volunteered to help with search efforts, even donated money to the reward fund. It wasn't difficult to seem concerned. I was concerned, just not for the reasons people assumed. Chloe had been taking notes throughout the confession, but she found herself struggling to process the casual way Hartwell described manipulating community grief for his own psychological satisfaction. The memorial services he'd attended, the scholarship fund he'd supported, the safety initiatives he'd championed, all had been elaborate forms of psychological masturbation that allowed him to relive his crime while being praised for his compassion. "Mr. Hartwell," Chloe said, opening the third folder, "we're investigating other cases that might be connected to you. Young women who died under similar circumstances in places where you lived, worked, or traveled." For the first time since beginning his confession, Hartwell looked genuinely surprised. "Other cases?" Chloe spread photographs across the table. Rebecca Martinez from Seattle, Jennifer Thompson from Tacoma, Lisa Walsh from Portland, Maria Santos from Spokane, and 6 others whose cases shared characteristics with Sarah's murder. These women died between 1987 and 2019. All were young, all were found in isolated areas, all cases went unsolved. We're reviewing your employment history, travel records, conference attendance. Hartwell studied the photographs with the kind of careful attention he'd once brought to grading student papers. When he looked up, his expression carried what Chloe could only describe as pride. 15, he said quietly. 15 what? 15 victims over 32 years. You've identified 8 of them correctly. You're missing 7 others, and you've included 2 cases that weren't mine, Rebecca Martinez and Lisa Walsh.
Those were committed by someone else entirely. The room fell silent except for the humming of the recording equipment. Chloe felt her understanding of the case expand exponentially. Not just one cold case solved, but potentially 13 additional murders that could finally be closed. 13 families who might finally get answers. 13 communities where someone's daughter, sister, friend had been killed by a predator who'd spent decades hiding behind a facade of educational dedication and community service.
Over the next 6 hours, with breaks for meals and attorney consultations, Tom Hartwell provided detailed confessions to 13 additional murders spanning 3 decades. Each confession was carefully documented, corroborated against case files, and verified through details that only the killer could have known. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic predation disguised as professional responsibility and community service. Jennifer Thompson, 20, killed in Tacoma in 1999 while Hartwell was attending an education conference. He'd spotted her jogging near Point Defiance Park, followed her routine for 3 days, then approached her with the same routine about safety concerns that had worked with Sarah Chen. Amanda Rodriguez, 23, killed in Spokane in 2003 during a visit to his sister's family. She'd been working late at the university library where Hartwell had volunteered to help with a literacy program. Each case followed similar patterns. Hartwell would identify a young woman whose independence and confidence triggered his resentment, would study her routines until he could approach her in a way that seemed helpful rather than threatening, would use his position as an educator to build trust, then would isolate and kill his victims in locations where discovery would be delayed. After each murder, he would insert himself into community response efforts, attending vigils, supporting memorial funds, volunteering for safety initiatives that allowed him to relive his crimes while being praised for his compassion. The donations to Sarah's scholarship fund, Chloe said during the afternoon session, why did you continue those for 18 years? Each year when I wrote the check, I would remember that morning in the park, Hartwell replied with disturbing honesty. I would think about her face when she realized what was happening, about the moment when her trust turned to terror. The donation wasn't guilt, Detective Adams, it was gratitude. The psychological profile that emerged from 6 hours of confession was more complex and disturbing than anything Chloe had encountered in 2 decades of police work. Hartwell wasn't driven by sexual sadism or random violence, but by a sophisticated pathology that combined deep resentment toward young women who embodied confidence and opportunity with an equally deep need to be perceived as helpful, caring, and trustworthy by the communities where he lived and worked. "Why are you confessing now?" Chloe asked, near the end of the interrogation. "You evaded detection for 32 years. Even with the DNA evidence from Sarah's case, you could have fought the charges, claimed contamination, demanded extensive testing." Hartwell considered the question for a long time before answering. "I'm 64 years old, Detective Adams. I have prostate cancer that my doctor says will kill me within 5 years. My wife has been battling her own cancer for 2 years. I've spent 32 years carrying secrets that have required enormous energy to maintain. I suppose I'm ready to stop pretending to be someone I'm not." The confession concluded at 4:30 p.m., with Hartwell providing detailed information about the location of evidence he'd kept from several murders, jewelry, personal items, photographs he'd taken of his victims before killing them. The evidence would provide additional corroboration for his confessions and would help bring closure to families who'd spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. As Hartwell was returned to his cell, Chloe remained in the interview room surrounded by files, photographs, and legal documents that represented the largest serial murder case in Pacific Northwest history. 13 families would receive phone calls over the next few days, informing them that their decades-old questions finally had answers. 13 communities would learn that murders they'd attributed to random violence had actually been committed by someone who had used positions of trust and authority to access and kill their victims. The media response to Hartwell's confession was immediate and intense. By 6 p.m., news trucks from major networks were parked outside police departments in Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, and Portland as reporters scrambled to cover what was being described as one of the most significant serial murder cases in American history. The story had everything that attracted national attention. A trusted authority figure's decades-long deception, multiple jurisdictions, advanced forensic technology, and the psychological complexity of a killer who hid in plain sight while being celebrated for his contributions to education and community safety. Captain Morrison held a second press conference at 7 p.m. to announce that Hartwell had confessed to 13 additional murders and that investigators would be working with law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest to verify his claims and potentially solve cold cases that had haunted communities for decades.
This investigation represents both a triumph of modern forensic science and a sobering reminder of how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and public service, Morrison announced to a room packed with reporters from national news organizations. Our thoughts are with the families of all victims who have waited far too long for justice. The phone calls to victims' families began at 8 a.m. on November 14, 2024, each one delivered by detectives who'd spent years carrying the weight of unsolved cases and unfulfilled promises. Detective Maria Santos from the Spokane Police Department called the Rodriguez family to inform them that their daughter Amanda's 2003 murder had finally been solved. Detective James Walsh from Portland called his own family. Lisa Walsh had been his cousin, and her 1998 death had been both a personal tragedy and a professional obsession that had driven him to become a homicide investigator. Chloe made the most difficult call herself, to Jennifer Thompson's parents in Tacoma. Jennifer had been 20 years old when Tom Hartwell killed her in 1999. A nursing student who'd been jogging through Point Defiance Park when she encountered a friendly educator who'd expressed concern for her safety and offered to walk with her to ensure she reached her car safely. Mrs. Thompson? This is Detective Adams from the Bellingham Police Department. I'm calling about Jennifer's case. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, filled with the kind of breathless hope that comes from 25 years of waiting for news that might never come. "You found him?" Patricia Thompson whispered finally. "After all these years, you found the person who killed my baby?" "We found him, Mrs. Thompson. His name is Thomas Hartwell, and he's confessed to Jennifer's murder along with 12 others. He's been arrested and will be facing charges in multiple jurisdictions." The conversation that followed was both heartbreaking and cathartic. Patricia Thompson had spent 25 years wondering if her daughter's killer was still free, still dangerous to other young women. She'd attended self-defense classes, volunteered with victim advocacy groups, and donated thousands of dollars to cold case organizations, all driven by the fear that Jennifer's murderer was still out there and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was still working to find him. Did she suffer?" Patricia asked, the question every parent dreaded but needed to answer. "The medical examiner's report indicated that Jennifer fought bravely," Chloe replied, choosing her words carefully. "She didn't give up easily. She was strong and determined, just like you described her." Similar conversations were taking place across the Pacific Northwest as detectives contacted families who'd been waiting decades for answers. Each call brought relief, grief, anger, and questions about how Tom Hartwell had been able to kill so many people over such an extended period without attracting suspicion from law enforcement or the communities where he lived and worked. The revelation of Hartwell's true nature sent shockwaves through every institution and organization where he'd been involved. Bellingham High School announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive review of their hiring practices, background check procedures, and protocols for supervising staff interactions with students. The school board called emergency meetings to address community concerns and began the process of removing Hartwell's name from the teacher recognition plaque that had been installed in the main hallway in 2018. 3 former students came forward to report that Hartwell had made them uncomfortable with inappropriate personal questions, offers of special tutoring sessions, and boundary-crossing behavior that they'd attributed to an eccentric but caring teacher. None of the behavior had risen to the level that would have triggered formal complaints, but viewed through the lens of his confessed crimes, the pattern suggested systematic grooming and testing of boundaries with potential victims. Margaret Hartwell was hospitalized on November 15th after suffering what doctors described as a stress-induced cardiac episode. 39 years of marriage to a serial killer had extracted a toll that extended far beyond emotional trauma into physical manifestations of profound shock and betrayal. She'd spent 4 decades sharing a bed, a home, and intimate daily routines with someone whose secret life involved the systematic murder of young women whose only crime had been reminding him of students who hadn't responded to his inappropriate advances.
The community response evolved through predictable stages of grief and processing. Initial disbelief gave way to anger as people realized that they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted with their children's education and their community's safety. The anger was followed by guilt as community members questioned whether they should have noticed signs, should have been more suspicious of Hartwell's extensive volunteer activities, should have questioned why someone so concerned about safety was always available to help with activities involving young women. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the forensic psychologist from the University of Washington, arrived in Bellingham on November 16th to begin conducting interviews with community members, former students, and colleagues who'd interacted with Hartwell over his 37-year career. Her research would contribute to a comprehensive psychological profile that could help law enforcement agencies identify similar predators who used positions of authority and community trust to access potential victims. Tom Hartwell represents a category of serial killer that's particularly difficult to detect, Dr. Richardson explained during a community meeting held at Bellingham High School's auditorium. He didn't fit the stereotype of a disorganized, impulsive criminal. Instead, he was highly organized, socially skilled, and psychologically sophisticated. He understood how to exploit community trust and institutional authority to create opportunities for violence while building a reputation that made him seem incapable of such crimes. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit established a temporary field office in Bellingham to coordinate the multi-jurisdictional investigation into Hartwell's crimes and to review potentially connected cases from across the western United States. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, no relation to victim Rebecca Martinez, led the team responsible for verifying Hartwell's confessions and determining whether additional cases might be attributed to him. Serial killers often confess to crimes they didn't commit, either for psychological gratification or to manipulate the legal process, Agent Martinez explained to the task force that had been assembled to handle the complex investigation. We need to verify every detail of every confession through physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis before we can definitively close any cases. The verification process revealed the meticulous nature of Hartwell's planning and execution. He'd kept detailed records of his victims' routines, including photographs he'd taken during surveillance periods, maps of locations where he'd planned to commit murders, and even practice sessions where he'd rehearsed approaches and escape routes. The evidence had been hidden in a storage unit he'd rented under a false name in Ferndale, Washington, 25 miles north of Bellingham. The storage unit contained what investigators described as a murder museum, organized files for each of his 14 victims, including photographs, personal items he'd taken as trophies, detailed maps of crime scenes, and handwritten journals documenting his planning process and post-crime activities. The journals revealed the psychological satisfaction he'd derived, not just from killing, but from inserting himself into community response efforts and being praised for his concern about safety and his contributions to memorial activities. One journal entry from October 15, 2006, exactly 1 year after Sarah Chen's murder, provided disturbing insight into Hartwell's psychological state. Attended the memorial service for Sarah today. Her parents were there, still hoping for answers. I offered them my condolences and a check for the scholarship fund. They thanked me for caring about their daughter. If they only knew how much I think about her, how often I remember that morning in the park. The discovery of the storage unit and its contents provided definitive proof for 12 of Hartwell's 13 confessed murders and revealed one additional case he hadn't initially confessed to, the 1987 death of Rachel Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison or retired teacher Helen Morrison, a college student from Olympia who'd been found dead in Capitol State Forest. Rachel had been Hartwell's first victim, killed during his second year of teaching when he was still developing the methods and psychological frameworks that would characterize his later crimes. The Rachel Morrison case provided crucial insight into Hartwell's evolution as a serial killer. Unlike his later crimes, which showed sophisticated planning and execution, Rachel's murder had been relatively impulsive and disorganized. Hartwell had attacked her during a hiking trip, but had panicked and fled without taking the trophies or implementing the careful post-crime procedures that characterized his subsequent murders. The lack of organization had made the case difficult to solve at the time, but it had also provided Hartwell with important lessons that he'd incorporated into his later crimes.
The Rachel Morrison case shows us how Tom Hartwell learned and refined his methods over time. Agent Martinez explained during a briefing for investigators from multiple agencies. Each subsequent crime was more carefully planned, more psychologically sophisticated, and more successfully integrated into his public persona as a caring educator and community member. The legal proceedings began in December 2024, with Hartwell facing murder charges in 5 different jurisdictions. He'd agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for life sentences without the possibility of parole, avoiding death penalty prosecutions that would have extended legal proceedings for decades. The plea agreement required him to provide complete cooperation with ongoing investigations and to testify if any connected cases went to trial. The first sentencing hearing was held in Whatcom County Superior Court on January 15, 2025, for Sarah Chen's murder. The courtroom was packed with victims' family members, community members, former students, and media representatives from across the country. Chloe sat in the front row, carrying a folder containing letters from Sarah's family in Taiwan and from community members who'd been impacted by the case. David Chen had traveled from Taiwan for the hearing, accompanied by his elderly parents who'd insisted on making the journey despite their advanced age and the emotional difficulty of confronting their daughter's killer face to face. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Lee Chen, had written a victim impact statement that David read in both English and Mandarin, ensuring that Hartwell understood the full extent of the damage his crimes had inflicted on people who'd traveled across an ocean to give their daughter opportunities that American democracy had promised but failed to protect. "Sarah was our hope for the future," David read, his voice breaking as he struggled to maintain composure. "She wanted to become a doctor not for money or prestige, but because she believed healing others was the highest form of service to humanity. You didn't just kill our daughter, Mr. Hartwell. You killed the hundreds of patients she would have saved, the medical research she would have conducted, the family she would have raised. You killed our dreams and replaced them with 18 years of wondering, hoping, and grieving." Hartwell sat motionless throughout the impact statements, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like the respected educator he'd pretended to be than the serial killer he'd revealed himself to be. When Judge Patricia Williams asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and addressed the courtroom with the same measured tone he'd once used for parent-teacher conferences and school board presentations. "I have spent 37 years teaching young people about history, about learning from the mistakes of the past, about taking responsibility for actions and their consequences," Hartwell said. "I failed to apply those lessons to my own life. I cannot undo the harm I have caused, cannot restore the lives I have taken, cannot repair the trust I have betrayed. I can only acknowledge the truth of what I have done and accept the consequences that justice demands." Judge Williams sentenced Hartwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 99 years to be served consecutively. Similar sentences would follow in the other jurisdictions where he'd committed murders, ensuring that he would die in prison regardless of any potential changes in parole laws or sentencing guidelines. The media attention surrounding Hartwell's case catalyzed significant changes in law enforcement practices across the Pacific Northwest. The Washington State Patrol established a new cold case unit specifically focused on reviewing unsolved murders involving victims who'd been approached by individuals claiming to be concerned about their safety. The FBI updated its behavioral analysis protocols to include warning signs related to authority figures who inserted themselves into community safety initiatives following violent crimes in their areas. Bellingham High School implemented new policies requiring psychological evaluations for all staff members who volunteered for activities involving unsupervised contact with students. The school district also established anonymous reporting systems that would allow students, parents, or staff members to report concerning behavior without fear of retaliation or disclosure. The Sarah Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund, which had unknowingly accepted donations from Sarah's killer for 18 years, was restructured and renamed the Sarah Chen Justice Foundation. The foundation expanded its mission beyond providing college scholarships to include funding for cold case investigations, victim advocacy services, and research into the psychological profiles of serial killers who used positions of community trust to access potential victims.
Margaret Hartwell filed for divorce on February 14, 2025, after 39 years of marriage. In her petition, she requested to legally change her name back to her maiden name and to be assigned no financial responsibility for legal costs related to her husband's crimes. She also donated their family home to the Bellingham Domestic Violence Shelter, saying she could never live in a space that had been contaminated by the presence of such calculated evil. The community healing process was facilitated by Dr. Richardson and a team of trauma specialists who conducted group counseling sessions for former students, colleagues, and community members who'd been affected by the revelation of Hartwell's crimes. The sessions focused on helping people process feelings of betrayal, guilt, and anger while developing frameworks for rebuilding trust in community institutions and authority figures. The most difficult aspect of cases like this is that they shatter our fundamental assumptions about safety and trust, Dr. Richardson explained during one community session. Tom Hartwell didn't just kill 14 young women. He violated the social contract that allows communities to function, the assumption that people in positions of authority and trust are who they appear to be. The investigation into potentially connected cases continued throughout 2025, with FBI teams reviewing unsolved murders in 23 states where Hartwell had traveled for education conferences, family visits, or vacation trips.
3 additional cases were identified as likely connected to Hartwell, bringing his total victim count to 17 young women killed over a 38-year period. Each newly identified case brought both closure and renewed grief to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate family members to include friends, classmates, colleagues, and entire communities that had been forever changed by the sudden, violent loss of young women whose lives had been full of promise and potential. The detective Ray Kowalski was promoted to sergeant in recognition of his work on the Hartwell investigation and was assigned to lead the new cold case unit that had been established within the Bellingham Police Department. The unit's first priority was reviewing all unsolved cases from the past 30 years to identify other potential serial killers who might have used similar methods to evade detection. Chloe was offered a position with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, but she declined in favor of remaining in Bellingham to continue working on cold cases and to serve as a liaison between local law enforcement and federal agencies investigating serial crimes. Her expertise in long-term case management and her understanding of how predators used community trust as camouflage made her a valuable resource for investigations across the region. The Sarah Chen case, which had defined Chloe's career for 18 years, was officially closed on March 15, 2025, exactly 19 years and 5 months after Sarah's death. But the case's impact on law enforcement practices, community safety protocols, and public awareness of how serial killers operated would continue for generations. This document chronicles the lasting impact of the Sarah Chen murder case, spanning from 3 years after its resolution in 2024 to 15 years later in 2039. It reveals how one cold case investigation fundamentally transformed law enforcement practices, community safety protocols, and public understanding of predatory behavior. Sarah Chen was a 19-year-old Taiwanese exchange student murdered in 2005 by Tom Hartwell, a respected high school teacher in Bellingham, Washington. The case remained unsolved for 18 years until Detective Chloe Adams and her team finally identified Hartwell as the perpetrator. Hartwell had used his position of community trust and authority to kill 17 women over 38 years, from 1987 to 1919, manipulating public perception to avoid suspicion while inserting himself into community safety initiatives and victim advocacy efforts. The investigation's most significant legacy became the Sarah Chen Protocol, adopted by police departments in 43 states by 2027 and eventually 78 countries by 2034. This protocol established standardized procedures for investigating cases where authority figures inserted themselves into community responses following violent crimes. It required background checks and psychological evaluations for volunteers in victim advocacy organizations, memorial committees, and safety initiatives.
The protocol proved remarkably effective, helping identify 3 additional serial killers in its early years: an Oregon youth pastor who killed 7 hikers, a California volunteer firefighter responsible for 12 disappearances during emergency evacuations, and an Idaho school board member who murdered 5 college students over 2 decades. By 2039, the techniques developed during the Hartwell investigation had contributed to resolving 3,847 cold cases worldwide. The Sarah Chen International Justice Initiative, directed by Sarah's brother, David Chen, funded cold case investigations in developing countries and established victim advocacy centers in 15 cities. The DNA testing fund, created in Sarah's memory, had helped resolve 12,156 cold cases across 6 continents. Most significantly, 241 serial killers were identified using psychological profiling techniques developed by Dr. Amanda Richardson during the Hartwell case analysis. These methods focused on recognizing predators who exploited institutional trust and community vulnerability rather than fitting traditional serial killer stereotypes.
The Bellingham High School was renamed the Sarah Chen Educational Center in 2026, becoming an innovative campus focused on criminal justice education, victim advocacy training, and community safety research. Detective Adams served on the advisory board and taught weekly seminars on cold case investigation techniques to students from across Washington state. The case inspired 3 documentaries, a dramatic miniseries, and Dr. Richardson's comprehensive study that became required reading in criminal justice programs nationwide. The International Conference on Cold Case Resolution, with Adams as a frequent keynote speaker, drew law enforcement professionals from around the world to learn the investigation techniques that had proven so effective. Detective Chloe Adams advanced to captain and director of the Pacific Northwest Cold Case Consortium before retiring to become senior research consultant at the Sarah Chen Memorial Library at the University of Washington. For 15 years, she maintained the ritual of visiting Sarah's grave annually with updates on cases solved and lives saved through techniques developed from the original investigation. Margaret Hartwell, Tom's widow, who legally changed her name to Margaret Stevens, became an unexpected advocate for families of serial killers. Her book, Married to a Monster: Surviving the Discovery of Evil in Plain Sight, became a resource for therapists and law enforcement professionals dealing with similar cases. She continued speaking at conferences about recognizing warning signs that families and communities might miss. David Chen evolved from a grieving brother into an internationally recognized expert on victim advocacy, establishing the Sarah Chen International Justice Initiative and expanding its reach across Asia. His work ensured that Sarah's case became a catalyst for justice worldwide, not just domestically. The case prompted widespread institutional changes beyond law enforcement. Communities implemented new oversight procedures for authority figures interacting with vulnerable populations. Educational institutions established reporting systems for identifying patterns of inappropriate behavior. Victim advocacy organizations developed training programs to help people recognize manipulation tactics used by predators who exploited positions of trust. The memorial garden and bronze statue of Sarah Chen became symbols of transformation, depicting her not as a victim, but as a young woman full of life and determination. The inscription emphasized how her dream of becoming a doctor and healing people was ultimately fulfilled through the healing her case brought to thousands of families worldwide. Tom Hartwell died in prison in 2026 after refusing cancer treatment, having spent his final months writing detailed accounts of his crimes for FBI behavioral analysts. His death brought mixed emotions to victims' families. Some felt relief, others felt cheated of the opportunity for continued confrontation during parole hearings that would never happen. The most profound impact was cultural. Communities learned that the greatest threats often came not from strangers, but from trusted authority figures. The case demonstrated how evil could camouflage itself behind community service, institutional authority, and public respectability. By 2039, Sarah Chen's murder had become the foundation for a global revolution in understanding predatory behavior and investigating cold cases. What began as one family's 18-year search for justice evolved into a movement that saved countless lives through improved safety protocols, enhanced investigative techniques, and increased community awareness. The case's ultimate lesson was about persistence, the refusal to abandon victims who seemed forgotten, and the understanding that justice, though delayed, could still be achieved through determination, scientific advancement, and the courage to question trusted authority figures. Sarah's death, intended to be a doctor who healed people, instead became the catalyst for a different kind of healing that prevented immeasurable suffering and brought justice to thousands of families worldwide.